The factory stank of oil, steel, and something else, something electric, not just in the wires and the rivet guns, but in the air. You could feel it in your teeth, like static before a thunderclap. It was March 1944, and I was walking shoulder to shoulder with a group of Red Army officers through the main assembly line at the Glen L. Martin plant in Omaha. Officially, they were military observers. Unofficially, they were here to see if America's so-called war machine was real, or just another capitalist illusion wrapped in advertising. Colonel Dmitry Reznikov had already made up his mind. I could tell. He had that smirk I'd seen a dozen times in briefings, the kind that said, "We've been building tanks in the snow while you've been sipping Coca-Cola." He tapped his cigarette case, lit one, and blew smoke with theatrical disdain. "You Americans talk of numbers, but numbers don't win wars. Steel, blood, and discipline do." I didn't answer, not yet. Because I knew what was coming. 27 minutes into the tour, the air changed again. The massive bay doors at the far end of the line began to part, and the rhythmic pounding of machinery seemed to pause. Everyone, Soviet, American, engineer, officer, turned to look. Out rolled a brand-new B-29 Superfortress, still gleaming, still smelling of sealant and fresh paint. Its skin shimmered under the overhead lights. 4 Wright R-3350 engines sat idle for now, each capable of generating over 2,200 horsepower. Not a scratch on her, not a part borrowed, fully assembled, fully combat-ready. Colonel Reznikov's cigarette paused midair. I checked my watch. "Exactly 1 hour since the last one," I said. He didn't reply. And then the next hour passed. And another B-29 rolled out. And another. This wasn't just production. This was tempo, industrial dominance turned into rhythm, like a metronome set to wartime. Earlier that morning, I'd been pulled aside by Brigadier General Langston. He handed me a folder marked, restricted, for briefing only. Inside, translated intelligence reports from Moscow. The Soviets were skeptical of American claims. They'd read our numbers: 8,000 planes per month, 50,000 tanks per year, a ship every day, a bomber every hour. They laughed, called it capitalist exaggeration. Langston narrowed his eyes. "Your job, Captain Miles," he said, "isn't to argue with them, it's to show them." The first thing I did was scrap the scheduled slideshow. No more patriotic reels, no grainy footage of Rossi the Riveter. I brought them here. To the line. Where American workers, some teenagers, some grandmothers, many women, wore goggles and coveralls and didn't stop when the Russians walked past. They just kept riveting, welding, fitting, testing. One Soviet major asked, "How many factories like this?" I pointed at a wall map. 57, I said, and that's just for aircraft. Another officer muttered something in Russian. I didn't catch it all, but I knew one word. Impossible. As the day went on, the rhythm became unbearable for them. Every 60 minutes, another behemoth emerged, fully fitted, from sheet metal to monster. I made sure they saw everything: the precision tools, the logistics board, the scheduling systems, each block accounted for to the second. "You see this tag," I said, pointing to a clipboard hanging on a bomber's tail section. "That crate of aluminum came in from Utah yesterday, milled in Kansas City, shaped in St. Louis, welded here, all in under 36 hours. Reznikov folded his arms, all with no central command. "No commissar," I smiled, "just a system." After the 5th plane rolled out, they stopped talking. After the 7th, they stopped writing in their notebooks. And after the 9th, Reznikov took off his cap, held it in his hands, and stared as the 10th B-29 rolled into sunlight. It wasn't just the bombers. It was what they meant. Each one carried more range, more bombs, more altitude than any Soviet machine. Each one was a monument to scale, design, and logistical mastery. This wasn't production, it was projection. Power distilled into aluminum, roaring out every 60 minutes like clockwork. Reznikov finally spoke. We could build a dozen tanks in a day, maybe 2 dozen, but this, he gestured toward the bomber, this is something else. We walked past the engine test rig, where one of the Wright R-3350s thundered like a hurricane in a cage. The Soviets winced from the noise. I didn't. I'd gotten used to it. You say we laugh at your numbers, Reznikov said to me quietly, voice nearly lost under the roar. But I see now, they are not numbers. He paused. They are weapons. Reznikov didn't say much after that. None of them did. We walked the rest of the floor in near silence, boots echoing on polished concrete, their eyes constantly darting, counting rivets, glancing at tool stations, whispering observations to one another. But it didn't matter. The machines spoke louder than any of them. We rounded the corner where the hydraulic fitting stations operated. Over a dozen aircraft in varying stages of completion stretched before us like a metallic assembly line of giants. Wings still exposed, fuselages unpainted, instrument panels blinking under the hands of workers in denim overalls. One of the Soviet engineers, Major Pavlov, a soft-spoken man with oil-stained hands and round wire-rimmed glasses, leaned in and said something to Reznikov in Russian. Reznikov nodded slowly. I knew what he had said. I didn't need to speak Russian. He was asking, how is it possible this many planes are finished, and these are not even finished yet? Because while one aircraft rolled out every hour, another dozen were simultaneously in final stages, each staggered by minutes, forming a pulse of continuous completion. The tempo was impossible to match. Reznikov looked at me again. Why do your workers not rest? He asked. I smiled. They do, but we don't all rest at the same time. He blinked, trying to process that. Back home, Soviet factories shut down entire shifts for food, smoke, state-mandated meetings. Here, lunch was staggered, rotations never stopped. There was no single pause in production. The machine never slept. We moved into the control center, an elevated glass-walled room overlooking the entire assembly floor. Engineers sat in front of panel boards, slide rules in hand, updating timelines on wall-sized Gantt charts, moving colored pegs and ribbons across wooden boards. It looked like a war room, because it was. A young female supervisor in khakis walked up to me and handed over a schedule sheet. 46 minutes to next rollout, she said crisply. I turned to Reznikov. You'll want to watch this one. It's number 187. Why is that significant? It's going to the Marianas. It'll be dropping bombs on Japan within the month. He flinched. The smirk was gone now, his fingers clenched behind his back. Pavlov mumbled something under his breath. I caught one word, Saipan. We descended back onto the floor, just in time to see 187 being wheeled out. This one was different. It had teeth painted on the nose and a name scrawled just under the cockpit, Thunder's Answer. One of the flight crew walked alongside it, African-American, tall, confident, Sergeant Riley Henderson, flight engineer. He spotted me and gave a quick salute, then noticed the Soviet observers trailing behind. He leaned over and whispered, They don't think we're real, do they? No, I said, but they're starting to. Riley grinned, They will. Then he hopped aboard. The engines coughed once, then roared to life, each one lighting up in a synchronized ballet of power. The whole aircraft trembled for a moment, and then began its taxi toward the test strip, trailed by maintenance crews and jeeps. The Soviets watched every movement like hawks. Reznikov turned to me. What is that man's role? Flight engineer. He is African. Born in Georgia, grew up on a farm, taught himself mechanics fixing tractors. You allow him to operate the engines. I let him fly the plane if he wants. That hit like a sledgehammer. Not just the scale, not just the production, but the fact that every assumption they had about race, about labor, about who could do what was being burned down in real time. Later that evening, we sat in a debriefing room. No flags, no slogans, just coffee, a chalkboard, and a few scattered reports. General Langston entered and sat down across from Reznikov. "I trust you found the visit illuminating," he said plainly. Reznikov didn't reply. Langston opened a folder, pulled out a photo, a reconnaissance shot of a Soviet plant near Chelyabinsk, blurred, snow-covered, tanks half-covered in tarps. "We know you're building hard," Langston said. "So are we." He slid over another photo. This one was crystal clear. Dozens of B-29s lined up on an airfield in Kansas, everyone painted, crewed, fueled. Behind them, more arriving. "This," he said, tapping the photo, "is just one base. There are 14 more like it." Reznikov leaned forward. "You're not afraid of showing us this?" Langston shrugged. "We don't need to hide. You came here thinking numbers were a joke, but here numbers are reality, and every number has wings." Silence. Then Reznikov stood. He walked to the window and looked out over the darkening tarmac. Another B-29 was rolling out, this one illuminated by spotlights. Steam vented from its exhaust. It looked like a monster being born under moonlight. I walked up beside him. "You know," I said, "when the Japanese first saw these, they called them shiny death." Reznikov nodded slowly. "You are building a weapon, not just of metal, but of time." That night, as the Soviets were driven back to their lodgings, I stayed behind. The plant didn't stop. Shift B had taken over. The tempo continued. Every hour, the doors opened, and another steel behemoth emerged into the darkness. We weren't just building planes. We were building inevitability. 1 week later, I received a sealed envelope from Army intelligence. Inside was a translated Soviet cable, intercepted en route to Moscow. It read, "Observation confirmed. American tempo, not propaganda. Production rate unsustainable for us to match. Recommend reassessment of strategic doctrine." I folded the note and looked out over the flight line, where Thunder's answer had returned for final loadout. Inside, Riley Henderson was running systems checks. He saw me and waved. I waved back. Above us, another B-29 roared overhead, engines howling across the prairie night. And in that moment, it became clear. The Soviets didn't fear what we had already built. They feared what we could build next. Because if every hour brought another machine of war, what would we unleash tomorrow? 3 days later, the Soviets were still in the States, this time flown to Wichita, Kansas, to see the heart of Boeing's operations. If Omaha was impressive, Wichita was something else entirely. It didn't hum with productivity. It roared. They were driven in just before dawn, before the sun had even warmed the prairie frost, and before the scent of burnt oil could fade from the night shift, the morning crew had already taken their stations. Trucks pulled up with fresh aluminum coils. Forklifts hissed and beeped. Conveyor belts clattered into motion. And the moment we stepped onto the observation platform, we saw it. A full row of B-29s in final stage fitting, stretching across the hangar like silver titans waiting for a command to rise. Reznikov, Pavlov, and their aides stood frozen. Not in fear, but in silence. Because they were watching something they'd never seen before. Not in Moscow, not in Leningrad, not even in the captured facilities of Eastern Europe. They were watching a system that didn't rely on slogans or force. It relied on flow. Material came in one side. Weapons of war came out the other. and it did so with a kind of ruthless grace no amount of ideology could explain away. We guided them to the catwalk above Assembly Line 4. A shift supervisor, blonde, short-sleeved, sleeves rolled, clipboard underarm, pointed at a wall-sized chart. Every 10 minutes, a status update. Every hour, a new rollout. Every day, 24 bombers. Is this all B-29s? Reznikov asked, voice low. Just this line, I said. Line 2 is for B-17 overhauls. Line 3 assembles B-29 wings from scratch. Line 1 just expanded into jet testing. He blinked. Jet. I nodded but said nothing more. Let the gears turn in his head. Let him wonder how far ahead we already were. Later that afternoon, we brought them to the command synchronization room, a chamber that didn't exist in any Soviet plant. It was something between a dispatch center and a mind palace. Projectors shone onto white glass panels, showing train schedules, cargo loads, factory backlogs, and coastal weather, all updated in near real time by phone relay. From here, said Langston, we can redirect production between 37 factories. If Chicago hits a bottleneck, Denver picks up the slack. If snow hits Utah, Phoenix reroutes shipments. It's not just about making one plane. He tapped the map. It's about making them forever. Pavlov stepped forward and ran a finger along a chart. You've built resiliency, he said in his halting English. Many roads to same result. I nodded. No single point of failure. No Stalin to scream if factory slows. Langston chuckled. No need to scream. The system screams on its own when it breaks. Reznikov didn't laugh. He looked tired and older than before. That evening, we attended a test flight. They stood with binoculars as the bomber taxied out, engines spooling up. They expected noise, chaos, a tangle of confusion like back home. Instead, they watched a ballet. Signal crews timed every wave perfectly. Ground vehicles cleared with precision, and then wheels up. The B-29 lifted like a metal swan into the pink Kansas sky. Riley Henderson was aboard that flight too, this time in co-pilot training. I watched him bank right, then begin a slow climb over the factory. Spotlights followed him. The Soviets tracked his silhouette. Reznikov muttered something in Russian. Pavlov translated. He said, we make steel sing in Russia, but you make it dance. They didn't know it yet, but that very aircraft would drop its payload over the Bonin Islands just 3 weeks later, disrupting a major Japanese reinforcement convoy en route to Iwo Jima. That mission would cripple their timetable. It wasn't even considered high priority by American planners. It was just another routine run. Another drop in the sea of American tempo. That night I found Reznikov alone in the observation lounge. He sat in the dark, smoking a thin cigarette, staring at the flight line through the glass. You know, he said without turning, when I was boy my uncle worked at a tractor plant in Saratov. He built one machine a week, one tank every 10 days during war. He died in that factory. Cold took him. He was proud to serve. I didn't say anything. He continued. Here your people build machine after machine. They don't die, they go home, eat steak, kiss wife, then return to build more. He tapped the ash into his cup. Maybe this is why you win. I sat across from him. It's not just the steak, it's the why. He looked up. Our workers build not because we command them to, but because they know their brother is flying one of these bombers. Their son, their friend, it's personal. He didn't answer, but he understood. And in that moment, something changed in him. Not surrender, but recognition. 2 days later, they were scheduled to depart. A military C-47 would fly them to Washington for debrief before they boarded a Soviet vessel home. But just before they left, Langston made one final gesture. He handed them a folder with data. Production figures, test results, strategic forecasts, nothing top secret, but nothing they expected to be given freely. Pavlov thumbed through the numbers. His eyes widened. "You are showing us this?" Langston smiled. "Because even if you gave these numbers to Stalin himself, it wouldn't matter." "Why not?" "Because it's already done." He tapped the folder. "This isn't a projection, it's yesterday's output." Back on the flight line, another B-29 rolled out. No ceremony, no flags. Just steel, systems, completion. Reznikov stood beside me, watching. "I still do not like America," he said flatly. "Neither do the Germans," I said. He cracked a smile, his first. As they boarded the C-47, Pavlov paused at the steps. "You will win this war," he said. "We intend to." But after he hesitated, what then? I looked out over the sky, ribbons of contrail crisscrossing from the test fields. More bombers, more transports, more engineers arriving by the hour. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I did know this. We hadn't just shocked the Axis. We left the Soviets wondering, not just if they could match our tempo, but whether anyone ever would again. 2 months later, I stood on the tarmac of Tinian Island, the largest airbase the world had ever seen, until we built another one just like it, and then another. Rows of B-29s shimmered in the tropical heat, wingtips stretching out so far they looked like they could shade entire villages. It was unlike anything the Soviets had imagined, and to be honest, it was unlike anything we had imagined just a year earlier. I watched as crewmen in undershirts, soaked with sweat and streaked with grease, fueled the next wave of bombers. In the background, a squadron of freshly arrived superfortresses from the States taxied into position. 14 bombers had landed in the last 12 hours, each one straight off the line, still smelling of Detroit metal and Kansas oil, each one immediately fitted into a new sortie schedule. I stepped into the mission briefing hut, clipboard in hand. Riley Henderson was inside, leaning over a map of Tokyo. He'd earned his commission, now Lieutenant Henderson, full flight engineer on Thunder's Answer, which sat fueled and armed on Strip Charlie. He nodded at me as I entered. "We're taking her up again at 500, he said. "Command wants a test run over Iwo to see how much resistance is left." I raised an eyebrow. "That'll be your 4th sortie this week." He shrugged. "We've got the fuel, got the bombs, got the birds, may as well fly M." And that, right there, was what the Soviets could never understand. Not just the numbers, not just the production, but the attitude, the culture that came with knowing the machine behind you could outlast anything. Back in Washington, word had come down through Army intelligence. Reznikov's report to Moscow had been thorough, over 50 pages of observations, diagrams, rough production figures. He hadn't tried to spin it. He had told the truth. And Stalin wasn't pleased. American tempo, he said, was a hurricane wrapped in an assembly line. Soviet attempts to replicate it had already failed. They'd tried setting up 24-hour shifts, had forced new quotas, but their factories cracked, machinery wore down, workers fell asleep at machines. Shipments were delayed by snow, poor roads, bureaucratic tangles. Because it wasn't about hours. It was about systems. About vision. That same week, we received decrypted communications from Japanese intelligence units stationed on Kyushu. They reported unprecedented waves of bombers. Civilians counted over 200 aircraft in a single formation. Airfields were leveled, railway hubs shattered, and the worst part, they said, was the precision. B-29s weren't dropping at random. They were hitting rail lines, power stations, fuel storage facilities, and then returning again the next day and the next. And the numbers. They never got smaller. Only bigger. Back on Tinian, I sat with Riley and his crew under the wing of their bomber. Sweat soaked through our uniforms. The air buzzed with mosquitoes and tension. "I heard a new crew flew out from Nebraska last week," Riley said, tossing a cigarette into the sand. "They did," I nodded. 13 new planes, 10 more on the way." "Back home," he said, "my brother's working the night shift at the plant. Every time we take off, I think about him. Like, maybe he put in one of the bolts that holds this wing together." I looked up at the massive airframe. The rivets shone in the sunlight. It was hard to believe something this big could even fly. But it did, every day. Riley leaned back. "You think the Soviets'll ever figure this out?" I didn't answer right away. Because I knew he didn't mean the bombers. He meant the machine. The thing we had built that wasn't made of aluminum or steel. The culture of forward. Back in the States, reports filtered in from other plants. Seattle was adding another line. Detroit had shifted half its auto production into bomber subassemblies, without missing a beat. California had started testing jet engines to be mounted on next-gen bombers. Even as we fought the largest war in human history, we were already preparing for the next phase. Then came the firebombing raids. March 9, 1945, Operation Meeting House. 334 B-29s flew over Tokyo. They didn't drop high-explosive munitions. They dropped napalm-filled cluster bombs. The city caught fire like dry grass. Winds whipped the flames into cyclones. It was hell from above, and we had delivered it with perfect logistical precision. Tokyo burned for hours. The raid killed more people than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki would months later. And yet, within 48 hours, every single aircraft used in that mission had been refueled, rearmed, repaired, and slotted into another strike rotation. Soviet analysts, poring over intercepted Japanese reports, were stunned. In Leningrad, a factory director collapsed when he saw the footage. They weren't shocked just by the destruction. They were shocked by the continuity, that even after a strike of that scale we didn't miss a beat, that every bomber that left, came back, got turned around, and launched again. There was no pause. No peak. Only forward. Meanwhile, the Soviets began trialing their own heavy bomber program, the Tupolev Tu-4. But they didn't design it. They reverse-engineered it. From a B-29 that had made an emergency landing in Vladivostok. They copied it down to the rivet. Even the English-language instrument labels. Because they knew they couldn't beat us with something new. All they could do was imitate. But there was one thing they couldn't copy. The infrastructure. The invisible arteries that moved parts across 3,000 miles. The supply chains that balanced aluminum production in Texas with final assembly in Wichita. The shipping lanes guarded by Navy convoys, timed to arrive in lockstep with factory demand. The fact that one worker in Illinois tightening a bolt on a fuel tank was part of a choreography that reached all the way to a bombardier pulling his release lever over Tokyo. They couldn't copy that. Because you couldn't steal a culture. You had to build it. Back on Tinian, I sat in the tower as another wave of B-29s rolled down the strip. Riley's bird among them. Thunder's answer. She was painted different now, more scars, more mission stencils along the nose, one for every run. They were running out of space. The engines roared, the wheels lifted, and the machine rose again. Another sortie. Another answer. And somewhere in a bunker outside Moscow, Colonel Reznikov stared at a chalkboard of numbers. He erased the ones from February. wrote new ones for April, then crossed them out again. Because by the time the Soviets finished calculating, we'd already launched another bomber. It was August 1945 when the world finally understood the full weight of American production, not just as numbers, not just as planes, but as consequence. The clouds over Hiroshima had barely begun to dissipate when the Soviets called an emergency meeting of their senior military observers. The Americans had done something that defied every chart, every projection, every political assumption. They hadn't just dropped a bomb. They had built the machine to carry it. And they'd done it with clockwork regularity. The B-29 Superfortress named Enola Gay wasn't a prototype. It wasn't a one-off. It was one of hundreds. The day after the bombing, Thunder's Answer flew its 49th mission. Riley was still on her crew, still quiet, still methodical. When I saw him during post-flight, he was different, not shaken, not boastful, just aware. "We always talked about turning steel into power," he said to me, rubbing the black soot from his neck. "But now, we turned it into history." I didn't reply. There wasn't anything to say. Because he was right. In Washington, the Soviet embassy requested a private viewing of the footage from Hiroshima. Langston was in the room when they watched it. He told me later they didn't blink. They just took notes. They asked about the delivery altitude, about the flight path, about fuel range, about the turnaround time, always the tempo. Reznikov was not present. Word was, he'd been reassigned to a design bureau east of the Urals. But the impact of his report remained. It had spread through the corridors of the Kremlin like a cold wind. Not fear. Certainty. That the United States had done something no other power had. They had made war industrial. Predictable. Scalable. Inevitable. Meanwhile, production didn't slow. Even after Hiroshima. Even after Nagasaki. Even after Japan's surrender. Planes still rolled out every hour. Some would be repurposed, others mothballed. Some were broken down for scrap, parts cannibalized for civilian aviation. But the point was never the plane. It was the machine that made the plane. And that machine never stopped. 1 year later, I was invited to a conference in Berlin. The war was over. The lines had been drawn. The Cold War was beginning in whispers and veiled glances across treaty tables. At the airfield outside the conference center, several aircraft were on display. British Mosquito, Soviet Tu-2, American B-29. 3 officers stood beneath the wing of the Superfortress, pointing up at its massive engines. One of them wore Soviet insignia. He looked vaguely familiar until I saw his eyes. It was Pavlov. He saw me too. We nodded but didn't approach. He stepped back and scribbled in his notebook. Then, almost out of habit, he looked at his watch. And that was when I knew. They were still counting. Still timing. Still wondering if they'd ever match the hour. Back home, the plants were transitioning. From bombers to passenger liners. From tanks to tractors. From war to peace. But the infrastructure, the people, the tempo. It remained. It bled into every part of post-war America, into highways and railroads, into school construction, housing, automobile plants, television manufacturing. The why had changed, but the how had not. Because when a nation learns to build at that scale, it doesn't forget. 20 years later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, Russian postmark, typed but signed in pen. It read, "The machine you built was not just one of aluminum and gasoline. It was of culture, of motion, of resolve. We could not replicate it. We could only chase it. D. Reznikov. By then, the Soviets had finally built their own intercontinental bomber fleet. They'd sent men to space. They deconstructed immense cities behind iron walls. But they never quite caught up. Because in 1944, they thought America was bluffing. They thought the numbers were propaganda. They laughed until they stood on the factory floor and saw 10 bombers roll out in a single day. Until they watched one take off every hour. Until they heard the hum of the rivet guns at 3 a.m. in Wichita. Until they felt the heat of napalm storms dropped with mechanical precision. Until they saw Hiroshima vanish into ash, delivered not by magic, not by myth, but by a system. And that was the lesson. It was never about one plane. It was about what came after. And after. And after. We didn't win the war because we built the best single bomber. We won because we could build 100 more before breakfast. And make sure every single one of them came back.